The ceramic mug warmed my hands, the coffee inside a dark, steaming promise against the crisp morning air. My gaze drifted upward, past the perfectly manicured rose bushes that I grudgingly maintained, past the slightly too green lawn, thanks, HOA-mandated fertilizer schedule, to the peak of my roof. There, silhouetted against a sky just beginning to blush with dawn, spun my dragon. Not a real dragon, obviously. Just a beautifully crafted copper weather vane, shaped like a majestic, slightly mischievous beast mid-flight, its tail pointing precisely northeast. It was more than just a wind indicator. It was a silent sentinel, a gleaming testament to my late grandfather's boundless creativity and stubborn spirit. He'd spent weeks in his workshop, hammering and shaping the metal, the scent of solder and ambition clinging to his clothes. "Every home needs a little bit of magic, Alex," he'd declared, presenting it to me on my first homeowner-versary. "And a good dragon always knows which way the wind blows." Now, as I watched it twirl, catching the first golden rays of the sun, a quiet sense of contentment settled over me. This was my little slice of heaven, my sanctuary, my perfectly imperfect kingdom in the otherwise bland landscape of Summerfield Meadows. Summerfield Meadows. The name itself conjured images of idyllic fields and golden light, but the reality was more beige. Imagine a suburban architect's fever dream, where every house adhered to a strict palette of taupe, ecru, and greige, lest individuality dare rear its ugly head. The lawns were uniformly mown, the shrubbery immaculately trimmed, and the only splashes of color were the HOA-approved annuals that rotated with the seasons like a botanical clockwork display. It was the kind of neighborhood where a misplaced recycling bin felt like an act of rebellion, and an unapproved porch light could spark a community-wide crisis. I knew there was an HOA, of course. You couldn't escape them in this corner of the USA. They lurked in the covenants, an unseen entity that occasionally surfaced to remind us all about the precise shade of exterior paint, or the acceptable height of a hedge. For the most part, though, they'd been a dormant beast, content to send out newsletters about pressure washing your siding and the upcoming Summerfield Sizzle potluck nobody ever attended. My dragon weather vane had, for 3 glorious years, existed in blissful ignorance of their bureaucratic gaze. That blissful ignorance, it turned out, was about to be shattered by a piece of paper and a strip of remarkably aggressive Scotch tape. I was heading out to grab the morning paper, a quaint analog habit I stubbornly clung to, when I saw it. A crisp, cream-colored envelope, its edges sharp and unyielding, affixed with an almost surgical precision to my front door. Not tucked into the mailbox, that would be too conventional, perhaps even neighborly, not slipped under the mat, which might imply a modicum of discretion. No, this required the ceremonial application of Scotch tape, like a crime scene investigator marking evidence. It was a power move, subtle yet undeniable, designed to command immediate attention and perhaps induce a minor heart palpitation. My internal monologue, a constant sarcastic companion, immediately kicked into gear. Ah, the official HOA missive. I bet it's about the rogue dandelion I saw yesterday, bravely defying the monoculture of fescue. Or perhaps my mailman's car was deemed non-conforming for parking too long in front of my house. The horror! I peeled the envelope off, careful not to tear the pristine paper. The adhesive was surprisingly strong, a testament to the HOA's commitment to delivering their pronouncements. The return address read, Summerfield Meadows Homeowners Association, Architectural Review Committee. My brow furrowed. The ARC. Those were the folks who decided if your new fence was aesthetically congruent with the community's vision. I hadn't had any recent visions, architectural or otherwise. I tore open the seal. The paper was heavy stock, the font formal, almost accusatory. My eyes scanned the first few lines, and then my breath hitched. Subject, violation notice, unauthorized rooftop apparatus. My dragon. It had to be. The letter, a masterpiece of bureaucratic passive aggression, went on to explain, in excruciating detail, how my beloved weather vane detracted from the harmonious aesthetic of the community and was a blatant disregard for the established architectural guidelines set forth in the Summerfield Meadows covenants, conditions, and restrictions, specifically Section C, Paragraph 4. It demanded its removal within 14 days, failure to comply resulting in fines, further enforcement actions, and possibly public shaming at the annual Summerfield Sizzle potluck. The audacity. My initial reaction was a bewildered laugh. A weather vane? This perfectly innocuous, charming, functional piece of rooftop decor was now a rooftop apparatus and a blatant disregard? It felt like being scolded for wearing socks that were too colorful. I reread the letter, searching for any hint of a misunderstanding. Perhaps it was a template sent in error. Perhaps they meant the neighbor's ghastly pink flamingo collection that mysteriously appeared every spring. But no, the address was mine, the description clear. Copper wind direction indicator affixed to the main dwelling roofline. A slow burn of indignation began to spread through me. This wasn't just about a weather vane. This was about principle. This was about a small, personal act of expression being squashed by the beige tyranny of conformity. My grandfather's dragon, which had weathered actual storms, was now facing a metaphorical hurricane of HOA nitpicking. I found the contact number at the bottom of the letter. It wasn't a general office line, it was a direct cell phone number, ending in an extension. For Architectural Review Committee inquiries, please contact Carol. Carol. Of course it was Carol. Carol was the newly elected HOA board president, a woman who treated the community covenants like sacred texts and wielded the power of the ARC with the gravitas of a Supreme Court justice. I'd seen her once, meticulously measuring a neighbor's hedges with a tape measure, a grim determination set on her face. She didn't just enforce rules, she embodied them. Taking a deep breath, I dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a voice, crisp and unyielding as the letter itself, answered. Summerfield Meadows Homeowners Association, Carol speaking. Her voice was like polished granite, smooth, but utterly inflexible. Hi, Carol, I began, trying to keep my tone light, almost apologetic. This is Alex Henderson from 123 Maple Lane. I just received a violation notice regarding my weather vane, and I think there might be a misunderstanding. Mr. Henderson, she replied. No warmth, no flicker of recognition. There's no misunderstanding. The weather vane is an unapproved rooftop addition. Section C, Paragraph 4 of the Covenants clearly states all rooftop additions must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee. A weather vane is not on the list of approved items. Furthermore, its whimsical design detracts from the uniform aesthetic we strive to maintain. But it's been up for 3 years, I interjected, a sliver of desperation creeping into my voice. The previous board never said anything, and it was a gift from my grandfather. The previous board, Carol stated, a hint of disdain in her voice, was, shall we say, lax. I am merely ensuring we all adhere to the standards we agreed to when we bought our homes. It protects our property values, Mr. Henderson, and personal sentiment, while understandable, does not supersede the community's architectural guidelines. There was a pause, a deliberate, icy silence that screamed, "My word is final." You have 14 days to remove it. Failure to do so will result in a $50 fine per day, escalating to a lien on your property if not rectified promptly. But 14 days, Mr. Henderson. Click. The dial tone hummed in my ear, a stark, flat sound that mirrored the feeling in my gut. I stood there, phone still pressed to my ear, staring at the copper dragon glinting innocently on my roof. 14 days, a $50 fine, a lien on my property, all for a weather vane. The quiet contentment of the morning had evaporated, replaced by a slow, simmering anger. Carol and her beige brigade had poked the wrong dragon. They wanted compliance? Oh, I would give them compliance. Compliance so absolute, so irrefutable, it would make her perfectly manicured hedges wilt in shame. The gauntlet had been thrown, and I, Alex Henderson, was about to pick it up and build something truly magnificent. So I did what any sane, well-adjusted adult would do when faced with a minor, easily solvable conflict. I eschewed all reason and declared a silent, disproportionate war. My battlefield wasn't going to be the front lawn or a shouting match at the next potluck. No, my theater of operations was going to be the one place Carol and her ilk held most sacred: the fine print. Fueled by a fresh pot of coffee so strong it could probably strip paint, I unearthed the gargantuan 3-ring binder I'd received at closing. The Summerfield Meadows covenants, conditions, and restrictions. It was a document so dense with legalese it probably had its own gravitational pull, a black hole of bureaucratic nonsense designed to bore any homeowner into submission. But not me. Not today. Today, I was a man on a mission. A mission fueled by pure, unadulterated spite. I spread the pages across my dining room table, the sheer volume of paper a testament to the HOA's love of regulation. I read about approved mailbox designs, the Charleston Classic in obsidian black only. I learned about the maximum allowable height for decorative lawn flamingos, 0 inches, as they are strictly prohibited. I delved into the minutiae of trash can placement, the approved species of deciduous trees, and the very specific Pantone color codes for acceptable front door paint. It was a masterclass in stifling joy. Finally, I arrived at the hallowed text. Section C, Paragraph 4, Rooftop Structures and Protrusions. It was just as Carol had said. It was a masterpiece of vague prohibition. No political signage, no commercial banners, no livestock. I was genuinely curious about the incident that necessitated that clause. It was all about what you couldn't do. But as I scanned the sub-clauses, my eyes caught a glint of hope, a tiny crack in their fortress of beige. It was sub-clause 7B, an addendum that felt like it had been hastily added in the 90s, probably after someone wanted a giant TV antenna to watch X-Files. It read, "Exceptions to the above prohibitions may be granted for antennae and structures primarily purposed for scientific data collection and/or personal safety, provided said structures are installed by a licensed professional and comply with all applicable local, state, and federal regulations." I read it again and again. The words seemed to hum on the page. Scientific data collection, federal regulations. A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. Carol had quoted the rules, but she hadn't read the footnotes. She had built her case on the foundation of this document, and I had just found a load-bearing wall made of pure, unadulterated loophole. My grandfather's simple weather vane was whimsical. Fine. I would give them something that was the polar opposite of whimsical. I would give them science. My fingers flew across my keyboard. My first search was simple. Personal weather stations. A million little plastic contraptions popped up, the kind you buy at a hardware store. Cute, but not nearly magnificent enough for my purposes. My next search? Professional weather stations. Now we were getting somewhere. These were more robust, with taller masts and more complex sensor arrays. But I needed more. I needed the final, unimpeachable piece of the puzzle. What was the magic ingredient? Federal regulations. My final search? Weather station requiring federal approval. The screen blinked, and there it was, in glowing blue letters from a government website. FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. Apparently, any structure over 200 feet requires FAA approval. But even for smaller structures, especially those that could be mistaken for aviation obstructions or that provide meteorological data used for aviation purposes, you could, and in some cases were encouraged to, register their location and specifications with the FAA to have them noted on aeronautical charts. It was a layer of bureaucratic armor so thick, so official, so utterly unimpeachable, that the thought of Carol trying to argue against it made me giddy. I leaned back in my chair, the plan blooming in my mind in all its glorious, terrible detail. I wouldn't just install a weather station. I would install a commercial-grade, scientifically calibrated, professionally certified weather station. It would have a foundation. It would have a galvanized steel mast, and it would be voluntarily registered in the FAA's database, making it, for all intents and purposes, a federally recognized structure. I looked over at my cat, Claus, named for his uncanny ability to appear whenever a can was opened, who was sleeping soundly on a pile of discarded bylaws. "You see, Claus," I whispered, the words tasting like victory. "Carol wanted me to remove my unauthorized rooftop apparatus. She wanted compliance, so we're going to comply. We're going to comply so hard it's going to circle back around and become an act of glorious defiance. She zigged, so we're going to zag, with extreme prejudice and meteorological data." Claus opened one eye, gave me a look of profound indifference, and went back to sleep. He was right. It was time for action, not words. The next morning I started making calls. It was an experience. The first contractor I called was Jim's handyman service, a local guy whose van I saw around the neighborhood. The conversation was a comedic train wreck. "Hi," I said, trying to sound as normal as possible. "I'm looking to get a quote on installing a personal weather station in my yard." "Oh yeah, sure thing," Jim replied, his voice friendly and straightforward. "You talking about one of them little Accurite jobs from the hardware store? Happy to mount it on a pole for you, run you maybe $100? "No," I said slowly, savoring the moment. I was thinking something a little more substantial. Something that might require a concrete foundation and FAA registration. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears in Jim's head grinding to a halt. "You running a private airport, buddy?" "No, just a very enthusiastic hobbyist," I said. "Right," Jim said, the suspicion thick in his voice. "Look, pal, I hang drywall and fix leaky faucets. I think you might need someone a little more specialized, or maybe a therapist. Good luck." He hung up before I could reply. One down. The next few calls went similarly. I was met with a combination of confusion, disbelief, and outright laughter. One guy at a home security company that also installed antennas asked if I was trying to communicate with aliens. I was beginning to think my grand plan was too grand. Then I found them. A company called Agri-Weather Solutions. Their website was full of pictures of towering metal structures in the middle of vast cornfields and on top of commercial buildings. Their slogan was "Precision Data for Serious Growers and Planners." This was it. I dialed the number. A gravelly, no-nonsense voice answered on the second ring. "Dave?" I took a deep breath and gave him my pitch, this time skipping the pretense and getting straight to the technical specs. I wanted a 20-foot mast, a concrete pier foundation, and a full sensor suite, Anemometer, rain gauge, pyranometer for solar radiation. The works. I mentioned the model number I'd found online. Dave was quiet for a moment. Unlike the others, he wasn't confused, he was calculating. "The Met Star 3000, he said, his voice a low rumble. "That's a serious piece of kit. We usually install those for golf courses or small municipal airfields. So let me get this straight. You live in a residential subdivision, Summerfield Meadows, and you want us to install a commercial weather tower in your backyard?" "That's the one," I confirmed, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "The whole shebang. It needs to be official, professionally installed, fully compliant." I heard a wheezing sound that I realized was Dave trying to stifle a laugh. "Son, that's for monitoring frost patterns on a 500-acre vineyard. What in God's name are you doing?" This was the moment of truth. I decided to go with a slightly edited version of it. "Let's just say," I said carefully, "that I have a very keen interest in the microclimates of my neighborhood, and a spirited disagreement with my homeowners association." There was a beat of silence on the line. I thought I'd blown it. Then I heard a low, slow chuckle. It was the sound of a man who had been in the business for 40 years and thought he'd heard it all, only to be delightfully proven wrong. "Say no more," Dave said, a newfound warmth in his gravelly voice. "I'll have a site surveyor out there tomorrow and a full quote for you by noon. Kid," he added just before hanging up, "I like your style." As I put the phone down, I glanced out the window. My copper dragon was still spinning faithfully on the roof, its days numbered. But it was okay. Its replacement was going to be legendary. Operation Overcast was officially a go. Dave, true to his word, was a man of action. The very next morning, 2 surveyors from Agri-Weather Solutions were in my backyard. They were a stark contrast to the usual neighborhood lawn care crews. Dressed in bright orange vests and armed with tripods, laser levels, and a general air of, "We are doing serious work here." They immediately drew the attention of the curtain-twitching brigade. I watched from my kitchen window as Mrs. Gable from number 42, a woman whose entire life seemed to be a reconnaissance mission conducted from her living room, peered through her blinds with the intensity of a Cold War spy. The surveyors were efficient and professional. They took soil samples, measured distances to the property line with unnerving precision, and drove a series of small, flag-topped stakes into my lawn. One of them, a younger guy with a friendly face, knocked on my door to confirm the placement. "Right here gives you the best exposure, away from the tree line, and it's exactly 20 feet from your back fence, well within city setback codes," he explained, pointing to a spot that was, to my immense satisfaction, in the direct line of sight from Carol's back patio. I signed the work order with a flourish. A week later, the real fun began. The promised flatbed truck, a behemoth that looked like it had hauled sections of the Golden Gate Bridge, rumbled down our quiet cul-de-sac at 8 in the morning. On its bed were several sections of galvanized steel, a pile of industrial-looking equipment, and a small but formidable-looking earth auger attached to a mini excavator. Dave himself rolled up in a dusty Ford F-250, emerging with a thermos in one hand and a set of rolled-up blueprints in the other. He gave me a gruff nod. "Mornin', let's build a science project." The neighborhood, which usually hummed with the gentle drone of electric lawnmowers and the occasional yapping dog, now echoed with the clang of metal and the roar of a diesel engine. Dave's crew, 2 guys named Marco and Luis, operated with a practiced, no-nonsense rhythm. They unloaded the auger and with a deafening roar began to drill into the earth where the surveyors had marked their spot. The hole they were digging wasn't a hole, it was a chasm. A perfect, 4-foot-deep, 2-foot-wide cylinder of displaced earth. My next-door neighbor, Bob, a retired accountant with a passion for grilling, wandered over to the property line, a look of profound bewilderment on his face. He was a good guy, perpetually clad in a kiss the cook apron, and his curiosity was always more friendly than nosy. "Hey, Alex," he shouted over the noise of the auger. "I thought you were kidding about the science project, putting in a new septic tank?" "Morning, Bob," I yelled back, walking over to him. "Nope, just a little atmospheric research." "Looks like a heck of a project," he observed, peering into the rapidly deepening hole. "That thing's big enough to bury a car." "Gotta have a stable foundation for good data," I said with a cheerful wink. Bob just shook his head, a bemused smile on his face, and wandered back to his prize-winning azaleas. One neighbor down, a dozen more to go. The climax of the morning, however, came with the arrival of the concrete truck. It was a rotating, churning behemoth that had to back its way down the street, its reverse alarm beeping a percussive, inescapable rhythm that announced its presence to the entire zip code. It was a beautiful, glorious disruption. It was also, apparently, Carol's bat signal. I saw her before she saw me. Her pristine white SUV, which was usually gliding silently through the neighborhood like a shark, was parked haphazardly at the end of her driveway. She wasn't driving, she was marching. She moved across her lawn, onto the sidewalk, and then directly onto my property with a speed and determination that would have impressed a drill sergeant. Her face was a mask of controlled fury, her mouth set in a tight, bloodless line. "Mr. Henderson!" she barked, her voice cutting through the mechanical symphony of my backyard. Dave, who was directing the concrete chute, glanced at me and rolled his eyes. I gave him a small nod and walked calmly to meet my accuser. I had prepared for this moment. I even had a prop. Tucked under my arm was a crisp, new clipboard holding a single, beautiful document. "Morning, Carol. A bit noisy, I know, sorry about the commotion, but we should be done with the loud part in an hour or so," I said, my voice dripping with manufactured neighborly charm. "Do not take that tone with me," she hissed. "What is the meaning of this? You haven't submitted any ARC applications for a foundation? This is a major structural installation. It is a flagrant violation of at least a dozen covenants." "Actually," I began, my smile unwavering, "I don't believe it is. You see, I took your advice and reviewed the bylaws very carefully. And I also reviewed the city building codes. Turns out, any freestanding structure under a certain height doesn't require an HOA review if its purpose is exempt. But it does require a city permit for the foundation to ensure it's up to code." I unclipped the paper from my clipboard and held it out to her. It was the official City of Summerfield permit for the installation of a concrete pier for a meteorological data collection mast. Her name was not on it. The HOA's name was not on it. But the city's official seal was gleaming in the morning sun. She stared at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. Her brain seemed to be short-circuiting, unable to process how I could possibly have a permit for something she had not personally approved. The city doesn't supersede the HOA," she finally sputtered, her voice rising an octave. "We have our own rules. What are you building?" "I'm building a small structure for scientific data collection," I said, using the exact phrasing from the bylaw. "As you know, Carol, Subclause 7B makes a clear exception for these. And to ensure full compliance, I'm making sure every aspect of the installation adheres to all applicable local, state, and, eventually, federal regulations. Just like the rulebook says." I had her. Her face, which had been a furious shade of red, was now slowly turning a pale, blotchy white. She had built her entire kingdom on the unshakable foundation of the rules, and I was using those very rules as a shield. She snatched the permit from my hand, scanned it furiously, and finding no flaw, shoved it back at me. Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched back to her house, the rigid set of her shoulders screaming defeat. It was a small victory, but it tasted sweeter than any coffee I'd ever brewed. With the concrete poured and Carol momentarily vanquished, the rest of the build was almost anticlimactic. The concrete needed a few days to cure, a quiet period during which I became the subject of intense neighborhood speculation. I could feel the eyes on my house every time I checked the mail. The Summerfield Meadows Neighbors Facebook group was, according to a friend who had infiltrated it, alight with theories ranging from a ham radio tower to a government surveillance antenna. Then, the day of ascension arrived. Dave and his crew returned with the tower itself. It wasn't just a pole. It was a magnificent, gleaming 20-foot galvanized steel mast, delivered in 2 sections. It was industrial, it was functional, and it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. While Marco and Luis began assembling the sections on the lawn, bolting them together with heavy-duty hardware, I took my camera out. I documented everything. Photos of the bolts, the warning labels, the manufacturer's specifications. I was creating my compliance folder, a digital fortress of evidence. They attached the sensor array to the top of the mast before raising it. The anemometer, a delicate-looking cup and vane system that would measure wind speed and direction. The rain gauge, a self-tipping bucket mechanism that was surprisingly complex. The pyranometer, a small white dome that would measure solar radiation. And, my favorite part, a small, FAA-compliant, low-intensity red obstruction light for the very top. The tower wasn't tall enough to legally require it, but the FAA guidelines suggested it for structures that could be perceived as an obstacle. And Dave had included it in the package with a knowing wink. It was the cherry on top of my malicious compliance sundae. Raising the tower was a work of art. Marco and Luis, with the help of a small winch, carefully walked the massive steel structure upright. It slid perfectly onto the thick anchor bolts embedded in the concrete pier. There was a series of loud, satisfying thunks as they secured the base with nuts the size of my fist. Then, it was done. It stood there, a gleaming silver sentinel in my backyard, dwarfing the weeping cherry tree next to it. It was absurdly out of place, a piece of industrial infrastructure dropped into a suburban Rockwell painting. It was clean, it was professional, and it was undeniably there. The little red light on top wasn't on yet, but I could already imagine its gentle, defiant pulse in the twilight. Dave slapped me on the back, a cloud of dust erupting from my shirt. There she is, solid as a rock. The wiring and calibration will be done tomorrow. She'll be broadcasting data by 5 p.m. I just stood there, a wide, goofy grin spreading across my face. I looked from the tower to Carol's house, where I could just make out a sliver of her face in the window, watching. This wasn't just a weather station. It was a declaration of independence. It was a 20-foot-tall steel and concrete middle finger to petty tyranny. It was a monument to the simple idea that if you push a quiet man too far over something small, he will build something enormous just to prove a point. And it was absolutely, unequivocally, the best money I had ever spent. The day after the tower went live was strangely quiet. The physical commotion of construction was gone, replaced by a silent, steely presence. My tower didn't make a sound, save for the gentle, almost inaudible whir of the anemometer spinning in the breeze, but its existence screamed across the manicured lawns of Summerfield Meadows. It was a 20-foot-tall question mark in the middle of a neighborhood that despised ambiguity. The reaction started as subtle shifts in the suburban landscape. More curtains were twitching than usual. Morning walks now included a deliberate, slow stroll past my house, heads craned upwards. I was no longer just Alex from number 123. I was the tower guy. I caught snippets of conversation from passers-by. "Can you believe the nerve?" From one camp, and a low, appreciative, "It's about time someone did something," from the other. I was a polarizing figure, a local Rorschach test for attitudes towards authority. To control the narrative, I launched my secret weapon. That evening, I put the finishing touches on my website, summerfieldmeadowsweather.com. It was a simple, clean design, featuring a live dashboard with all the data streaming directly from my backyard. But I didn't stop at the basics. I added custom modules that were so absurdly specific, so hyper-local, they bordered on performance art. Under live conditions, you wouldn't just find the temperature, you'd find current estimated temperature at the community pool mailbox kiosk. The wind speed wasn't just a number, it was prevailing breeze on the 4th hole of the adjacent golf course, may affect your slice. My favorite was the hyper-local pollen and allergen index, which offered thrilling updates like oak pollen count is currently elevated near the Elm Street cul-de-sac. Suggest keeping windows closed if you're sensitive. I posted a link to the website on the unofficial neighborhood social media page with a simple, cheerful message. "Hi, neighbors. To celebrate our unique local microclimate, I've set up a small weather station to provide real-time data for our community. Hope you find it useful for planning your gardening, car washes, or just satisfying your curiosity. Alex." The effect was instantaneous. Within an hour, the post had 50 comments. Carol and her loyalists immediately decried it as an eyesore and a blatant invasion of privacy. How one invades privacy by measuring humidity was never explained. But then something wonderful happened. Bob, the grilling enthusiast, commented, "This is fantastic. Now I'll know if it's too windy to fire up the smoker. Thanks, Alex." Then a mom from down the street wrote, "The pollen count is actually super helpful for my son's asthma." Bookmarked. My little science project was no longer just a monument to spite. It was a public utility. I had inadvertently created the one thing an HOA board fears most, a popular initiative they didn't control. This, of course, could not stand. 4 days after the website went live, the next salvo from the HOA arrived. It wasn't a friendly, cream-colored notice taped to my door. This one came via certified mail, a clear sign that things had escalated. The envelope was from a law firm, Dewey, Cheatham and Howe, attorneys at law. The name alone felt like a parody, but the contents were deadly serious. It was a formal cease and desist letter. I sat at my dining room table, the thick, creamy paper feeling heavy with menace. The letter was a 4-page symphony of legal threats, peppered with words I had to look up. It accused me of creating a public and private nuisance, of violating aesthetic covenants heretofore agreed upon, and of erecting a structure that posed a potential hazard to the community. It claimed my tower was causing irreparable harm to property values and the peaceful enjoyment of the neighborhood. It demanded the immediate removal of the unauthorized industrial tower within 7 days, or the HOA would seek immediate injunctive relief and pursue all available legal remedies, including, but not limited to, the recovery of all attorney's fees and costs. I'll admit, for the first time in this ridiculous saga, a cold knot of fear formed in my stomach. City permits and bylaw loopholes were one thing. A direct threat from a law firm with a silly name was another. This was real. They were threatening to sue me, to put a lien on my home, to bury me in legal fees until my defiant little science project bankrupted me. Have I gone too far? The thought ricocheted around my skull. Was this really worth it? Losing my house over a weather vane? I picked up the phone and called the only ally I had in this mess. "Dave," I said, my voice sounding a little shakier than I wanted. "It's Alex Henderson, the weather station guy. They're threatening to sue me." I heard a sigh on the other end of the line, followed by the sound of a chair creaking. "Let me guess," Dave's gravelly voice rumbled. "You got a scary letter from a lawyer talking about injunctive relief and heretofore this and that?" "Yeah, how'd you know?" "'Cause I've been doing this for 30 years, kid," he said. "HOAs are my bread and butter. You're what we in the business call a prestige job. These folks have more money than sense and a board president with a chip on her shoulder. It's the classic playbook. Step 1, send a nasty letter. Step 2, send a nastier letter from a lawyer. They're hoping you'll get scared and fold. It's a bluff." "It feels pretty real, Dave," I said, looking at the lawyer's letterhead. "Is the tower built to spec? Yup. Is it on a permitted foundation? Yup. Is it registered in the FAA database as a voluntarily disclosed structure? You betcha. Kid, you are bulletproof. You've done everything by the book. Their book, the city's book, the federal government's book. Their case is all fluff about aesthetics and feelings. Your case is about concrete and steel and permits. Let 'em rattle their sabers. Don't you dare touch a single bolt on that tower. Call their bluff." His confidence was a lifeline. He was right. I had built my defense as carefully as I had built the tower. I folded the letter, slid it into my compliance folder, and took a deep, steadying breath. The fear was replaced by a fresh wave of determination. Carol, however, wasn't done. When her legal threats were met with a week of defiant, data-broadcasting silence, she escalated to a level of pettiness I hadn't thought possible. She called the cops. I was in my office, monitoring a fascinating spike in the local dew point, when I saw the red and blue lights flashing against the living room wall. I peeked through the blinds to see a police cruiser parked at my curb. 2 officers were getting out, looking decidedly unenthusiastic. My heart pounded, but this time it was with adrenaline, not fear. This is it. I had been preparing for this. I grabbed my compliance folder from the filing cabinet, took a moment to straighten my shirt, and walked to the front door before they could even knock. "Good afternoon, officers," I said calmly, opening the door. The older of the two, a man with a weary mustache and the tired eyes of someone who had seen every brand of suburban drama, spoke first. "Afternoon, sir. We received a call about, He paused, glancing over my shoulder towards the backyard. "A suspicious tower on your property." "Ah, yes, the weather station," I said with a pleasant smile. "She's a beauty, isn't she? Just got her calibrated yesterday. Did you know the barometric pressure is currently 30.02 inches of mercury and falling? Might be some rain on the way." The younger officer bit his lip to keep from smiling. The older one was unamused. "The caller," he continued, his voice flat, "expressed concern that it was some kind of illegal broadcast antenna, and that you might be spying on the neighborhood, and something about a menacing red light." "The light!" I exclaimed, feigning delight. "That's my favorite part. It's a low-intensity obstruction lamp. FAA suggested, you know, for aviation safety awareness. As for spying, I'm afraid the only things I'm spying on are cumulonimbus clouds and pollen spores." I held up the thick binder. "I have all my paperwork right here, if you'd like to see it. City permits for the foundation, the manufacturer's spec sheet, my official registration notice from the FAA's database. It's all in here." I handed the binder to the officer. He took it, a bit surprised by its weight, and began flipping through the pages. His partner leaned over his shoulder. I watched as their expressions shifted from dutiful seriousness to begrudging respect, and finally to sheer, undisguised amusement. The younger one coughed to cover up a laugh when he saw the FAA document. The older officer closed the binder and handed it back to me, a flicker of a smile finally breaking through his weary facade. "Sir, it appears you are impressively thorough." He sighed and pressed the radio on his shoulder. "Yeah? Dispatch, this is Car 54. The situation at 123 Maple Lane is clear. The structure in question is a fully permitted and registered private weather station. It's a civil matter. Advise the complainant to cease calling this number." He looked at me. "Sorry to have bothered you, sir. It seems you've got everything covered." "No bother at all, officer. Happy to clear things up," I said. They turned and walked off my porch, but they didn't get back in their car. Instead, they walked directly across the street and up Carol's pristine driveway. I watched through the window as she came bursting out of her front door, her face a storm cloud of righteous indignation. I couldn't hear what was said, but I could read the body language perfectly. The older officer held up a hand to stop her tirade. He pointed a finger at her, then at my house, then back at her. He shook his head slowly. The younger officer stood with his arms crossed, looking bored. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute. Then the officers turned, walked back to their car, and drove away, leaving Carol standing alone in her driveway, her mouth agape, her face the very picture of impotent fury. She had played her highest card, and it had been declined. She had brought the law to my doorstep, and the law had, in essence, told her to leave me alone. I watched her retreat back into her beige house, and for the first time, I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to win. The forecast for Summerfield Meadows was changing, with a high probability of sweet, sweet victory. The public rebuke by the police seemed to break something in Carol. For 2 weeks, an eerie silence fell over Summerfield Meadows. No letters, no passive-aggressive glares over the fence. My weather website gained more followers. Bob grilled with newfound confidence, citing the low wind shear for the perfect smoke on his ribs. Life was surprisingly normal. But I knew it was just the calm before the storm. Carol wasn't the type to accept defeat. She was the type to regroup and call in the heavy artillery. The summons arrived on a Tuesday. A mandatory emergency community meeting was called. The letter, printed on the same creamy, self-important paper as the first notice, had a single, ominous agenda item. Discussion and vote on special assessment to fund legal action regarding the unauthorized structure at 123 Maple Lane. This was it, her final gambit. She couldn't force me to take it down. She couldn't get the law to do her dirty work, so now she was going for the nuclear option, making the entire neighborhood pay to fight her personal war. It was a bold move, but a desperate one. She was forcing everyone to pick a side. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse, a sterile room that usually smelled of stale coffee and quiet desperation, was packed. I'd never seen more than 10 people here at once, but tonight, nearly every household was represented. The air was thick with tension and the scent of cheap air freshener. I took a seat in the back, my compliance folder resting on my lap like a shield. Carol stood at the front, flanked by the 2 other board members who looked like terrified hostages. Behind her was a projector screen, displaying the title slide of a PowerPoint presentation. It read, in an aggressive all-caps font, "Protecting our property values and aesthetic harmony." I had to stifle a laugh. She began her presentation with the solemnity of a wartime prime minister. "Friends, neighbors," she started, her voice quivering with practiced sincerity. "We are facing a crisis, a challenge to the very fabric of our community." She clicked to the next slide. It was a grainy, zoomed-in photo of my tower, taken from an unflattering angle that made it look like a menacing tripod from War of the Worlds. She launched into a dramatic monologue about harmony, uniformity, and the dangerous precedent set by my flagrant disregard for the community's shared vision. She showed charts with dubious data suggesting a potential 5% drop in property values due to unaesthetic industrial structures. She spoke of the menacing red light that disturbed the nocturnal peace. It was a masterwork of fear-mongering and hyperbole. Finally, she finished. And so, The board has been left with no choice. We must take legal action. We are proposing a one-time special assessment of $200 per household to retain the services of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe and restore the visual integrity of our neighborhood. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. $200. She had put a price tag on her obsession, and it wasn't a small one. "Are there any questions?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room, daring anyone to challenge her. Slowly, I raised my hand. All eyes turned to me. "Carol," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I have a statement, if that's all right." She gave a tight, condescending smile. "Of course, Mr. Henderson. The floor is yours." I walked to the front of the room, leaving my folder on my chair. I didn't need it now. I stood beside her podium, turning to face my neighbors. "Good evening, everyone," I began. "I know my science project has caused quite a stir, and Carol is absolutely right about one thing. When we all bought our homes here, we agreed to follow the rules, so let's talk about the rules." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. "This is Section C, Subclause 7B of the Covenants. I won't bore you by reading the whole thing again, but it makes a very clear exception for structures for scientific data collection, provided they comply with all federal regulations. My grandfather's weather vane was deemed whimsical, so I did exactly what the HOA asked. I removed an unapproved item and replaced it with something that is 100% compliant with the very letter of the law we all live by. The foundation is permitted by the city. The tower itself is registered in the FAA database. I haven't broken a single rule." I paused, letting that sink in. This isn't about rules. This is about one rule for some and another for others. But my tower, it's not just about compliance. It's become something else. I looked over at Bob. "Bob, you told me you used the website to plan your barbecue last weekend, right? To make sure your brisket wasn't ruined by a sudden gust of wind?" Bob, surprised at being called out, turned a little red but nodded enthusiastically. "Heck yeah, it was perfect." I turned to another neighbor. "And Susan, you mentioned the pollen alerts were helping with your son's allergies, didn't you?" Susan nodded. "We know when to keep him inside now. It's been a huge help, honestly." "That's all this is," I said, my voice resonating with the sincerity that Carol's speech had lacked. "It's a tool. A useful, harmless, and, I can't stress this enough, perfectly legal tool that many of you are already using. The question tonight isn't whether my tower is a violation. We know it's not. The question is whether you want to pay $200 for a lawsuit that has no legal merit, all because our board president doesn't like the way it looks." A heavy silence fell over the room. I had reframed the debate. It was no longer me versus the HOA. It was common sense versus a personal vendetta. Then, a voice from the back of the room cut through the quiet. It was Frank, a retiree from number 78 who hadn't spoken at a meeting in a decade. "You know what, Carol?" he said, his voice raspy but strong. "Frankly, I'm more offended by your plastic flamingos you put out every May against the holiday decoration guidelines than I am by his tower. At least his thing does something useful." A shocked laugh rippled through the room. The dam had broken. "Yeah," shouted someone else. "And what about the approved paint colors? There are only 3 shades of beige. My house looks like a sad cardboard box." "She sent me a violation because my garden hose wasn't coiled in a circular, aesthetically pleasing manner," another woman chimed in. Suddenly, the room erupted. Years of pent-up frustration with Carol's tyrannical reign of beige came pouring out. It was a full-blown peasant revolt. The meeting had completely derailed from being about my tower into a referendum on Carol's leadership. She stood at the front, her face pale, as the community she had so meticulously tried to control turned on her. After 10 minutes of chaos, The vice president finally managed to restore order. We still have a motion on the floor," he stammered. "All in favor of the special assessment to fund legal action?" 3 hands went up. Carol's and her 2 terrified board members. "All opposed?" A forest of hands shot into the air. It was a spectacular, overwhelming defeat. The motion was dead. The war was over. I had won. The fallout from the meeting was swift and decisive. Carol, stripped of her authority and publicly humiliated, submitted her resignation from the HOA board via email the next morning. She sold her house 6 months later, moving to a condo with, I assume, a much more restrictive set of bylaws to enforce. The HOA, under new, more relaxed leadership, became a benevolent, almost non-existent entity. The beige curtain had lifted. People started planting more colorful flowers. Someone put up a tasteful, unapproved bird bath. It was anarchy, and it was beautiful. My status in the neighborhood was cemented. I was the weather guy, a local folk hero. Neighbors would wave as they checked my website on their phones. The tower was no longer a symbol of defiance, but a quirky, beloved landmark. A few weeks after the meeting, I undertook one final project. I climbed a ladder, and with a set of custom-made steel brackets, I carefully mounted my grandfather's original copper dragon weather vane to the side of the mast, about halfway up. It spun freely in the wind, a whimsical guardian now attached to its stoic, scientific protector. The problem and the solution, united at last. Months later, I was on my deck enjoying a perfect Saturday morning. The air was 72 degrees, humidity was a pleasant 48%, and a gentle 3 miles per hour breeze was coming from the northwest. I knew this because I'd just checked. A moving truck was parked across the street, and a new family was moving in. The husband, a friendly-looking guy in a baseball cap, wandered over. "Hey," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Just moving in. I'm Mark. I gotta ask. My wife has been wondering all morning. What's the story with the giant thing?" He gestured with his thumb at the gleaming tower in my yard. I took a long, slow sip of my coffee and looked up at my creation. The sun glinted off the steel mast, and high above, my grandfather's dragon pointed faithfully into the wind. A smile spread across my face. "Oh, that?" I said. "That's the Summerfield Meadows Community Early Warning System." Mark's eyes widened. "Really? Warning for what? Tornadoes? Hurricanes?" I chuckled. "No, nothing that dramatic," I said, taking another sip. "It's a warning system for a badly written HOA bylaw." He stared at me, then at the tower, and then back at me. A slow grin of understanding spread across his face. He nodded, a look of deep respect in his eyes. "Got it," he said. "Good to know." He walked back to his new house, and I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the peaceful, perfectly measured breeze. The forecast was clear, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like home.